You put desperate people in desperate situations and they cannot thrive. So if we continue as a collective to think that we have one right answer, or that one thing is absolutely going to fix us, or one thing is absolutely going to bring us down, we will continue to suffer until
Mhm.
our ultimate demise. That I think that I'm okay with that being a blanket statement about everything.
Mhm.
It can't all be black or white, despite my desperate desire for it to be.
So anyway, Francis, I have a question for you about those typewriters. Did you ever see that documentary on the California typewriter store, and Tom Hanks was featured because he collects typewriters?
I wasn't, but is the store based in Berkeley?
Yes, and they repair
I used to
typewriters.
go there all the time when I
Well,
lived
they made a
in
whole movie
in
about it.
that's so wonderful. It's crazy. I was just thinking about that place the
Well,
other
you know
day.
what? You owe yourself to watch that. It's one of the
Okay.
documentaries I like best, and I forget the name of it was something typewriter, the typewriter store or typewriter repair, and all you have to Google is Tom Hanks, California typewriter, all that stuff, and you can watch it because why were you going to the typewriter store in Berkeley?
I wasn't born with the name Francis. This is a new name for me. And 10 years ago, I was living in San Francisco
Hmm.
by myself, very lonely, and trying to become a writer. And
Yeah,
was writing on typewriters. And
good for you.
I thank you. I loved it. But I broke it and I didn't know how to fix it. So I took it to the store and they fixed my first Underwood and I wrote a whole book on that thing.
What was the book that you wrote on it?
It's a poetry book called Slammed. It's my former name is Jen Harris,
I
and
know
that's the author name that I
I've been checking
use.
all these name changes out and figuring it out. And I'm going to introduce you. So
Thank
let
you.
me just jump in here. My name is Frank Schaeffer, and you are watching and or listening to my podcast program, Facebook Live event called In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. And my guest today is Frances Story. I'll introduce Frances as Frances, and she can explain why this name keeps changing. Frances is a performance artist and writer based in Kansas City, Missouri, whose work has been featured in the Washington Post, Netflix, Queer Eye, um, TEDx, NPR, Creative Mornings, etc. And I am going to be talking with Frances today about herself and her life and all the work. But I also want to reference why we're having this discussion. And it was an article that I read with great interest in the Washington Post a couple of weeks ago or months ago, whenever. But it was something that I saw that really piqued my interest because it was a piece by someone who, in Francis's case, has worked, I guess, for the legalization of weed, marijuana, grass, whatever, but at the same time was raising concerns about the fact that, like the tobacco industry that had flown under the radar for a while before people called them on it, this push to legalize is unregulated. And I've been reading other pieces about psychotic breakdowns that certain young people are having and other things. So um, I want to talk about you and what you do and with your performance art and what you're doing in Kansas City, et cetera, et cetera. But if it's not too much trouble and you've got it there in front of you, would you read the article, including the title, the date as it appeared in the post, so we can locate this and then we'll get into a discussion about it. But I just think everybody watching or listening really be interested in what you bring up. It's not something you hear every day. So go for it, Frances. Thanks.
You got it. Thank you, Frank. Okay. The title is an opinion piece in the Washington Post from December 26, 2023. And the title is I am a marijuana enthusiast, but weed is getting a pass on health issues. As a lifelong marijuana enthusiast, now middle aged, it's easy to see weed through green colored glasses. Advocacy slogans read, you can't spell healthcare without THC. And TV portrays an attractive counterculture from Broad City to Bob's Burgers to survival of the thickest. There's also a lot of eye rolling from enthusiasts when it comes to any talk about negative effects. And there are many enthusiasts. A Gallup poll conducted in October showed that 70% of Americans support marijuana legalization. Less than a month later, Ohio became the 24th state to legalize recreational use. Quote, more than 50% of the US population lives in a state that has ended cannabis prohibition for adults, and nearly 75% live in a jurisdiction that has legalized medical or recreational marijuana, end quote. Watchdog news outlet Marijuana Moment reports. There's no such thing as a harmless drug. The marijuana industry and its proponents are getting a pass on its negative effects, especially addiction. As an industry that touts treatments for epilepsy, chemotherapy-related nausea, and chronic pain management, leaders should be held responsible for informing us of the possible risks. Substance usage can result in dependency. Recreation can become addiction. For marijuana consumers, it's called cannabis use disorder. Addiction to cannabis looks like using marijuana as a primary coping mechanism, putting yourself in harm's way, experiencing withdrawal symptoms, and failed attempts to cut back, to name a few symptoms. Only 4 to 5 of the 12 outlined in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders are needed to diagnose addiction. Marijuana advocates do not want to talk about addiction. First of all, no industry wants to talk about the harmful stuff, and until they're legally forced to. Looking at you, Philip Morris. Also, no one wants to rain on the parade of a hard-fought destigmatization, and scores of science and health journals are finally publishing verifiable results of Mary Jane's benefits. The more you know, the better decisions you make. That's why we need to treat marijuana addiction like other kinds of addiction, as a health disorder. Recently, Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis published Uncovering Genetic Roots of Marijuana Use Disorder, which studied almost 21,000 people diagnosed with cannabis use disorder. They found genetic links in areas previously associated with risk-taking behavior and nicotine addiction. Senior investigator Arpana Agrawal, a psychiatry professor at the university, stated, quote, it has been estimated that up to 20% of those who use cannabis will develop problems. When we think about why some people who use cannabis develop problems with it, about 50% of that risk is due to genetics. Combine this genetic propensity with a widespread social acceptance, and you've got high chances for an addiction storm. On top of addiction, large doses of marijuana can cause some major problems. Cedars-Sinai's reports daily users of marijuana could find themselves in the emergency room with severe vomiting, known as cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. Prolonged vomiting can also lead to a slew of other health issues. Other effects include difficulty breathing, panic, anxiety, and paranoia. Research is still being done on its impact on those with mood disorders, such as depression. Marijuana usage can clearly have some real consequences, but we can change the subject. The munchies and the giggles are fun, and compared to other drugs, there isn't much risk. You can't die from a marijuana overdose, and unlike alcohol, consuming marijuana doesn't incite violence or cause blackouts. Marijuana is hailed not just as the lesser of all vice-related evils, but more like a friendly therapist who helps the participant relax and open up. But if I'm on public transit and someone pulls out a flask, I worry for them and assume they have a problem. Anyone who needs to drink all day to get through is, by American definition, an alcoholic. However, if that person regularly vapes cannabis oil in public or personal environments, they don't face the same stigma. Perhaps they should. In recent decades, anti-marijuana propaganda such as Reefer Madness has been replaced by Hollywood's depictions of its harmless effects. Portrayals include whimsical characters and class clowns, Dazed and Confused, How High. Casual consumption depicts goofy and lazy behavior without issue, as long as you're not allergic and don't consume a bad strain or a potency far beyond your tolerance. Remember that poor guy in the backseat of the cop car in the opening scene of Super Troopers? I'm freaking out, man. The first time I smoked weed, I was a teenager hanging out with friends, drifting into the best mood of my life while listening to Fiona Apple. 20 years later, an avid weed consumer and advocate, I met my wife, who is sober. This reality prompted extensive reflection of and changes to my behavior. When your partner can be triggered into relapse, the consequences of consumption become much greater than misplacing car keys or working the first half of the day with a hangover. Now there's some skin in the game, and it belongs to the one you love. We all deserve that kind of candid reflection for ourselves as well. Times are changing. The least we can do is change them for the better. That starts with clearing the smoke around what addiction looks like, providing intentional education to a new generation of consumers, and in whatever we advocate for, acknowledging that nothing is all good or bad. If you need help, the SAMHSA National Hotline is 1-800-662-4357.
Hey, that is such a good piece and so thoughtful and balanced and contemplative. I love the tone of it. Um, I'm so interested in who you are, the performance art that you do, your story, your history. Let me just mention that you're in Kansas City, correct, as we speak?
I am.
Yeah, because I've had good experiences in Kansas City. I was invited twice by the public library, which, by the way, the public library in the city there is one of the most beautiful in the world.
Mm.
Certainly in the country. I just love it. Up on the top floor, they have a big meeting room that I filled twice with the help of National Public Radio on two different book releases, and was able to speak and get questions. And it was a fantastic audience. I have such a good memory of that space there. Anyway, that's just a personal little note. But let's talk about this article in terms of its genesis with the relationship you have with your wife. When did you meet her, and what's her name, and how long ago was that?
Her name is Ashley,
Hmm.
and I met Ashley. She came to the writing workshop that I teach in 2020,
Hmm.
and she's actually uh, she's actually an avid follower and tremendous fan of yours. So I promised I would tell you that when I came on today. She's quoted you for years, and so it's a real honor to have this conversation with you.
Well,
I met Ashley.
how have we never met when you're married to a fan of mine? I have two of them
Listen.
somewhere, and I think the other one's not very well.
Respectable. I know.
I didn't know that, but that's awfully nice. You tell Ashley, just to unto half my kingdom, whatever she wants. How great.
She'll be very grateful for that. I actually have a quote of yours on my whiteboard that she's a queer woman with a deep religious faith, and her father was a pastor, and her parents were missionaries. And when I asked her, as a person who I think I border on agnostic, when I asked her why and how she could maintain a faith after everything she's been through, she quoted you as saying, if I wanted to become an atheist, the first thing I would do is ask God for help. And
Yeah.
she holds on to that. So all that
Well,
to
you
say,
you say hi to Ashley for me and tell her that I'm so gobsmacked here. This was unplanned. I had no idea who you were or anything about you, except I really thought your piece was so thoughtful. And there's so much I want to talk to you about, but now I feel so complimented and out of my zone here to have
well, let's get back to it, Frank. Here's
yeah,
the
but I mean,
deal.
this is
Here's the
just
deal.
fabulous. People will think that I set that up. I did not.
You didn't. I sprung it on you because I didn't get a chance to say it earlier.
I have, I
I'm
have, yeah, I have some big questions for you, and I want to get to those. So, and I've written them down because I'm 71 and sometimes I forget things. But I want to make sure we get back to the substance here. But before we do that, tell me a little bit about your own. You're a writer. You're a performance artist. Tell us a little more about who you are to give a context to the questions I have for you here.
Absolutely. I met Ashley in 2020 at a workshop that I teach, and that was a point in my life. The workshop was 2 years old. It began because I had been in a really unhealthy mental state. I have struggled with substance abuse most of my adult life, and I needed to make some major changes. So I started making those major changes, starting with therapy in 2018. And my experience is that writing, specifically poetry, and performing, which the kind of meteoric rise of slam poetry and spoken word, the
Mm.
revival of that in the last 15 to 20 years, um, it gave me a place and an audience to process the trauma and pain I experienced throughout my life as a woman, as a queer person. I grew up in the Southern Baptist universe and was very much rejected as a person who came out very young.
Mm.
I didn't know I would be rejected, but I found out immediately that what I knew about myself was not okay by my church's standards. And that really sent me on a spiral. So, in order to reclaim my not even reclaim, in order to claim my life and my identity and my personhood, and not waste away believing that I do have something to offer and that I do have great and necessary gifts to give the world. I took my power back and I started getting help, and I got a lot of help, and I found myself in the right place at the right time, because I have been well received and incredibly uplifted and supported, and I've gotten opportunities that I would have never believed possible for myself prior to getting that help. So here we are today.
Well, the article really struck me as I mentioned after you read it, as something very wise and balanced, considered, mature, um, and a kind of an inflection point that pulled together a lot of stuff I've been reading. But I want to bring up a bigger question, because I detect in you a thinker, and I think that you would really be able to comment on some things. Now, I really think so because of your own life journey. It just seems to me that one of the marks of the period of history we live in the United States in particular, is what I would call the absolute law of unintended consequences. And this applies to so much. Um, Smartphones, social media was going to tie us all together. Now algorithms drive us apart into our little corner of far right-wing politics or far left-wing politics or whatever floats our boat.
Right.
Unintended consequence: teenagers all over the United States having real mental health issues because of their own addiction to social media. What happens with AI? The first thing that happens is that after 40 million downloads, an AI generated picture of Taylor Swift naked, phony, faked, has to be removed from Twitter X. Why they let 40 million downloads happen first. But again, the unintended consequence: here's this technology that's going to solve cardiac problems. And what do we do with it? The first big hit is some purient little garbage generated by some asshole who knows where
Mhm.
to hit up on this woman. Your article on the legalization of weed, and like it's going to be great and solve everything, and then all of a sudden, yeah, but these companies are now just big corporations again, like the tech bros became, with very little social responsibility. Another one that's coming up again and again: online gambling for young people, all this sports gambling that you see on all the sports programs, all the streaming services. So I don't want to go on, but I'd say they're all marked by one thing, and that is a disregard of unintended consequences, the profit motive for the people who immediately cash in. These are not mom and pop businesses, but on a huge scale, and they all are the same. Google's going to do these great things, and then it becomes this omnipresent company that's selling software to the Chinese government to spy on its own people, whatever. I just think your article kind of is a slice of that. It fits in there because what you're really saying is, hey, wait a minute, this is all nice, this kind of airy-fairy, let's just all, whatever, but there's a whole nother side to that. I don't know if you want to go there, but I think it raises an issue that you would know a lot about because of your own substance abuse struggles and just your own journey.
Mhm.
Talk a little bit about your perspective on my little sermon there.
I I believe that the American people have been told that they must polarize in order to have a belief system whatsoever. And what I actually believe is true, that we all carry around with us, is that we understand a both and can exist.
Mm,
I think that we live in these dichotomies every single day, big and small. We don't compromise our morals. We coexist among people who behave and act and live in ways that we do not behave and act and live. And the legalization of marijuana is no different from that. The consumption of substances responsibly within moderation
mm,
is a completely feasible thing to participate in if you do not struggle with addiction issues.
mm,
But to pretend that any drug is harmless, to pretend that something is all good, is only going to result in all bad circumstances.
sure.
I think we see that with some of the things that you named, social media, for instance.
Mm,
many people spoke about the potential polarization of social media, about opinion, which is what my article is. It is not a news report. It is opinion from a
Mm,
personal experience. Opinion is not fact. I offer fact to validate something I believe, and I ask people to allow themselves to peer into these questions and stretch, become uncomfortable.
mm,
If we do not do that with all subjects, I feel that we are objectively lost as a species.
mm, mm,
I live in a world of dichotomies all day long, and I experience, especially with marijuana legalization, I I never wanted to wind up in prison because of marijuana.
mm, mm,
Um, but I very much had experiences with the law in relationship to my usage of marijuana. And at the same time, I know people who made their living on the sale of marijuana for an extended period of time because they were in our government's legal system and they had no other option for income when released from something like prison. You
mm,
spend the rest of your life as a felon and nobody will employ you. You put desperate people in desperate situations and they cannot thrive. So if we continue as a collective to think that we have one right answer or that one thing is absolutely going to fix us or one thing is absolutely going to bring us down, we will continue to suffer until
mm,
our ultimate demise. That I think that I'm okay with that being a blanket statement about everything.
mm, mm.
It can't all be black or white, despite my desperate desire for it to be.
Yeah. Yeah, and sort of the currency of extremism and fanaticism is what we deal in these days. In terms of even just this podcast that I do, over the years that Ernie, my partner and producer, and I have been doing this, um, we have discovered that we're also trying to break out of this bubble mentality. I've got quite a few followers on social media, and I think a lot of them came to me because of my journey away from evangelicalism, then others because whatever concerns I have politically. Some of them have not been pleased that I have also been talking to some more conservative authors, or for instance, recently the former editor of the Wall Street Journal, who also was the editor of the Financial Times. And you get notes like, oh, well, Frank, I see you've gone to the right now. No, I'm just talking to somebody. Very much in the
Right.
framework of what you're talking about. And that is, I refuse to accept this black and white idea that just because I disagree with someone makes them an evil person. And or we can't even talk with those people. If you're going to talk to people like that, I'm no longer listening to your podcast. I just really am pushing back on that. And of course, I get guests that I'm interested in and then their work interests me. But, my first question to them is not, um, tell me your political views, or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party or voted for Trump or whatever the thing is. So talk to me a little more about that. And then I want you to dovetail from that into promoting your own work, because you've done a lot more than write this article. I'd like to hear about some of the other things you've been writing about. I've looked up some of this, but I want to hear it from you. The direction of your own interests, building from this base that you have, which I find, by the way, very laudable and sensible and reflects my vision as well, I hope. So promote your work a little bit, talk about yourself, and then talk a little bit about what we've just been talking about, this kind of black and white narrative that is practiced by both the left and the right, and all
Mhm.
points in between. That we shut each other off with these absolutes. So go ahead.
We absolutely do. I am an educator. That's what I'm good at. It's what I love to do. Um, it took me a long time to really determine that about myself. Um, when I walk into a room, often totally full of strangers, there are so many lives hanging in the balance of the kind of workshops I teach.
Mm,
People come to creative writing workshops as their rawest, most vulnerable selves.
mm,
And I feel that it is my personal responsibility to be tender in the presence of creative wounds. There's a lot of competition in this world that if you cannot be great at something, you should not try it at all.
mm,
There's a lot of individual glory in the American identity that you must monetize everything you have any interest in and you must be extraordinary at it. And if you're not constantly seeking credential and visibility, then that means you don't really want it, whatever it is. This starts in grade school with teachers telling kids that they aren't good at creative things. And People carry those wounds their entire lives.
Mm,
Often those people bring those wounds into my classroom, and they just want encouragement. The smallest, most tender, dear parts of them want to be seen and
mm,
appreciated and encouraged. And that is what I want to do. So I exist in this world where I recognize that I can't care about what someone does for a living. I
mm, mm,
cannot I can and will deep dive into someone's political or religious beliefs should we be on common ground and common
sure.
comfort of having that discussion and conversation. I'm a very fiery, resistant to being told I'm wrong person. I hate losing a debate, and I often have been in trouble for running my mouth about things that I'm absolutely sure I'm right about.
Mm,
The older I get, the more gray everything is.
mm,
And
mm,
I want to allow that to be true. I've also had the great opportunity of being deeply positively impacted by people whose political or religious beliefs do not align with my own.
mm, mm, mm,
I I cannot walk into a classroom and promise to serve the common interest of bettering the world if I believe that some people are inherently good and some people are inherently bad.
mm,
I cannot do that. So I don't. I try not to. I'm still a human being with all of my judgments and expectations of the way things should be. But I work very hard to hold life in an open hand.
mm,
And, and I think that people can only benefit from that perspective.
mm,
So that's what I work toward.
mm,
And my classroom has some very specific rules about being in this space with one another, not trying to fix anything when we share our work with each other, not trying to, I was in that situation one time and here's how I corrected my behavior. I also have a rule. I'll watch my language in your on your podcast, but I tell people not to be a jerk. And
mm,
whatever that means to them, that's how they need to manage themselves within my classroom.
mm,
We
mm,
are all adults here. We understand what it would feel like to be disrespected, called out rather than called in. I do not participate in cancel culture because I think that's a very narrow minded perspective. I don't advocate for that in any community I belong to because
mm.
I think we have something to learn from everybody. I
Yeah.
also very much believe that we could do this better if we were willing to stand side by side with people and not have to agree with them on
Mm,
everything. I don't want to spend my life with people who are just like me. I'm very bored with myself most of the time.
mm, mm.
So
Yeah,
I
I
value
love
that.
that comment about the cancel culture because I come at it a little the same, exactly the same point of view, but having, as I say, I'm 71 at this point, and I look back and I've been a writer, maybe written 15 books or so, novels and nonfiction, and sometimes someone will ask me, "Oh, in such and such a book, you said this or that," and what I have to quickly tell them is that any nonfiction book, especially if it's on some issue, politics, religion, whatever, is really just a snapshot of where you were that day. It's not, this is an ongoing process. And I think part of the journey that somebody who's a little older like me takes that teaches, I won't exactly credit myself with humility, but wisdom at one point anyway, is to understand that one of my objections to cancel culture is that it precludes the ability to learn and change.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been
Mm-hmm.
so wrong about so many things in my life on so many issues and grown and changed on them or personal behaviors. The people around me, like my wife, Jeannie, that I've been with now for 53 years, who have helped me because they stuck with the bad, stupid parts of me and helped me become more informed. They didn't just write me off. I'm only here because a few people in my life didn't just write me off. So to write somebody off as if somehow you are more informed or better than them basically says between the lines, I don't believe people can change. I
Absolutely.
believe in redemption.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I I think that it is healthy and acceptable to close the door when you know that your interaction with another person is no longer healthy for either one of you.
Yeah.
There are relationships that I can no longer revisit because it brings out the worst in me. That's
Mm.
not the kind of person I want to be in
Sure.
anybody's life. Absolutely. But I have to believe people can change. I experienced a very explosive negative reaction to my own coming out 20 plus years ago. And in this very moment, in this very day, I know my mother's very proud that I'm on this interview with you. And I
Oh,
know that my father is rooting for me. And I believe that my parents in their faith journey needed some time to process the experience, to separate the politicalization of my personhood from my personhood. They
mm,
needed to have their own conversations with their God and come to a conclusion that they had the opportunity to consider.
mm,
Expecting people to have a an understanding of something they've just been presented with no time for contemplation or examination is absurd. And
mm,
also it's a sign of the times, right? If something goes up on the internet, if you don't immediately have a reaction to it, you're missing out on the process. And
mm.
I think that's a very toxic way to live.
Yeah.
um, I just can't. I'm the first person to get on Instagram and lose hours of my day in that space.
Mm,
But I don't pretend it's healthy.
mm, mm. Yeah, I want to reintroduce you. You're listening to and or watching In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, which is a podcast. I'm talking today with Frances Story. We're going to talk now in a minute about her name changes because I'm curious about all that. And Frances is a performance artist, writer based in Kansas City, Missouri, whose work has been featured in the Washington Post, Netflix, Queer Eye, TEDx, NPR, and Creative Mornings. And we were talking about an article which, if you missed it and you've tuned in a little late, will be at the beginning of this podcast, at the beginning of this little program here on YouTube or wherever you find it. A fabulous article she wrote reconsidering not the legalization of weed, grass, marijuana, whatever you want to call it, but the unintended consequences of pretending that there aren't attendant problems along with this. And Frances comes herself from a substance abuse background. She also, and I want to emphasize this, mentioned that Ashley, her wife, is a fan of mine. I didn't know that, but now, we are. You tell Ashley she made my day by being your wife, and you greet her for me. But um, let me jump into something else here, just trivial for a minute. Talk about the name change and what that signified for you, and how you came up with that and why. I think that's an interesting inflection point. Oh, before I do that, I have to just say this as well for my producers, Ernie's mental health. Please subscribe to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Apple Podcasts and to my Substack. It has to be said at frankschaeffer.substack.com, where I make commentaries on the sorts of things that Frances and I are discussing today. And with that said, tell me about your name change. You went from what to what to what, and what names are you going to start calling yourself in the future, just so I can never figure out? Tell Ashley not to change her name.
We're done. All the paperwork's done. It was an exhausting
I want to
process.
keep track of my one fan.
I I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, I was living in San Francisco and I was really struggling with my sense of self. And so I started writing a character named Frances.
Hmm,
And the idea was that maybe I could write myself into being, as
hmm,
they so metaphorically suggest you do in every memoir writing book I've ever read. So I started writing about this character named Frances, and then I started introducing myself as Frances
hmm,
and not telling anybody my real birth name. And
hmm,
the sense of anonymity followed by a reclamation of personhood, of identity that I had not previously experienced
hmm,
was invigorating. I felt the most myself, and as if what had followed me to San Francisco would release its grip from me.
hmm, hmm.
Flash forward 15 more years, 10 more years, and I'm like, I don't know what day it is. I decided to change my name for that very reason. I
Hmm.
wanted to fully claim who I am. And in that, this name just
I've
came
got,
to me.
oh,
I did some research today
hmm.
on the background of my name out of pure curiosity, and it fits like a glove. So
How is that, by
previously,
the way? Because I'm a Francis too, but IS, you got the ES spelling and mine's FRNCIS. So what did you learn
yeah.
about our name, Francis?
I learned that our name means free, to be free.
Hmm.
Freedom and autonomy, individuality is a very big talking point for me. But it also means battle axe, and that feels right also.
Sounds good.
There it does. Um, so I previously existed and published under Jen Harris, under poet Jen Harris. That was my stage name. And I worked for almost a decade and wrote as a queer person who experienced a lot of trauma throughout their life and
Mm,
as a sexual assault survivor. When I started this journey, it wasn't commonplace to have these conversations on stage, but
mm,
the more I did it, the more people came to the next show. And I've spent my last decade in audiences of hundreds of thousands of people sharing these stories
mm,
and reconnecting with the truth of ourselves, which is we are not our pain.
mm,
I feel like I very much exercised this suffering out of me. And
mm,
when it was time to close the door on that part of my life, that's when I changed my name.
mm. You know, something that you were saying ties into a theme of mine, both in my current writing of a project I'm working on, but also, which I'm not promoting now nor naming, but I'm working on something, but also just a wider context of my own beliefs at this point, this snapshot in time. And that is, I think one of the diseases of the world we live in is judging people by their career definition. When we ask someone, you know, what do you do? We're trying to place them on the chart of income, importance, sort of like going to a party and looking over somebody's shoulder you're talking to see if there's somebody more important in the room. We
Mhm.
gravitate toward, you know, the important person. And I'd like your thoughts on that because, you know, as someone who's a performer, but also is a contemplative person, as I said before, and thinks about these things deeply, um, I want to talk more about your own work and your own writing and what you've been expressing in that. But just for a minute, take this problem that we have society-wise, where we have a kind of workism, career addiction in terms of judging people, rather than asking the real question is, who are you?
Mhm.
We're
Mhm.
having a kind of who are you discussion. So if someone says to me, what do you do? I'm not being a smartass when I say, well, what I do is this afternoon I'll pick up my youngest grandchild from school and she will
Mhm.
come home and cook in my kitchen and then we will hang out. And she's interested in Shakespeare and the King James Bible. So I will read her an Old Testament passage, not because I believe any of it is true. I'm not coming from that anymore, but because I want her to understand the English language and Shakespeare when she gets there and so forth. That's who I am. That's really my interest. It's not the next book I'm working on, and that's really true. Um, I'm Jeannie's husband. That's who I am. I'm somebody,
Mhm.
you know, Zip is my dog, and I love Zip very much. That's who I am. So let me talk a little bit about who you are, not what you do. And then I'd like you to segue to when you talk about being a performance artist, what do these performances consist of? If we were there, what would we be seeing and hearing? So first, who are you on the who are you side, which we've already been discussing, but go there a little more. We already know about Ashley, which is good. Uh, and then more conventionally, tell me about your work.
Absolutely. I am Frances Story and I am a writer
Mm,
and I am Ashley's wife and I waited 38 long years to find her in this world. So not
mm,
a day goes by that I lack in gratitude for her. I am privileged to be a part of the writing workshop KC's community and I never find myself lonely or bored or lacking in things to do or people to love. I I am a blue collar worker. I am a working class person. I was the first person in my family to go to college, the second one to graduate. I worked very hard to get where I am. And I think what that means to me is that I didn't want to end where I started.
mm, mm,
My parents struggled and struggled and struggled. They were young people who had children at a time in which the world changed very dramatically and everything they were raised to believe very much left them behind and they struggled.
mm,
And I am fortunate enough to have an able body and an able mind. And in this very segregated white supremacist America, I'm very aware that my skin tone has given me opportunities that other people are hoping for at this moment and fighting for. I don't want to waste a second of my life unaware of my privilege and my opportunity. And so, as I have become aware of it, I have taken advantage of it, and I have held the door open so that other people who deserve a place in this, who want a place in this, can run right through it. You know, if I can spend my life being a bridge, that's what I want to do. I feel most useful when I am helping people get where they want to go. I am a courageous person. I am a demanding person. I have high expectations of everybody around me, including forcing me to rise to the best version of myself on a regular basis, even if that means being in a combatant state with me on a regular basis. I I believe that who are you is a question that is easier answered when you live in poverty. I know this because I felt like I knew people better at the core of who they were when I didn't have any money. And I am blessed now with a beautiful home in a time when it's impossible to purchase houses, and I am part of a co-parenting team that's raising 3 boys in a very safe and lovely suburb. I drive a newer car around with my spouse when, we go out on our weekends off. All of these things are very fortunate in consumeristic America, but I don't know a lot about the people around me in a way that I did when I didn't have a car and I barely had a home. So I don't take any of this for granted. It's just it's very curious how difficult it is to pierce that veil and ask people to meet you in that space of really being seen. And I think a lot of that is that they've been taught to mask up and to be invisible, to not allow themselves to be vulnerable, because in that there's a lot of risk. It's very risky as you rise through. I was just listening to a podcast about this a couple of nights ago about a woman who, rose from nothing to very prominent fame in the early 19th century. She married a very rich and wealthy man, and she died by her own hand on the basis of constant suffering from feeling like an outsider. And I don't think that I'm at risk of that, but I do recognize that there's a lot of really lonely people who are surrounded by all the stuff that they were told to pursue. So I keep trying to build bridges to invite people back to themselves through their own work, especially through writing. Writing
Talk to me a
has
little bit about the co-parenting. I don't want that to just slide by, but
Sure.
also let's go to your work here. If people wanted to pursue more of your writing, I know that you have poetry, but you also have these articles you've written. We've looked at one Washington Post piece that I thought was very important that I had you read at the beginning of this little program podcast here of mine. Shorthand, we will link to everything you are or want to be on any site that you give Ernie, producer, so people will be able to find you. But if someone says, well, what have you written? I'll tell them about my novel Portofino because it still pleases me and I think it's a funny, good book. I'll tell them about my memoir Crazy for God because it's a shorthand way to explain, a lot about the history that I lived through. And I'll point them to this podcast, and that will take about 30 seconds. So give me a similar track in on who you are, Frances, and now that you've changed your name, how to find you under other names as well, since you're complicating your fan base here now. Some of us can't hold more than one thought at a time, let alone two
There it
names.
is. If you want to find me on Substack, it's iamfrancesstory.substack.com. You can find my 3 books of poetry on Amazon under Jen Harris. Those titles are Slammed, Lust and Disdain, and Unconfirmed Certainties. Otherwise, I spend my time teaching. I'm not I don't have particularly lofty goals for publication. When things like the Washington Post, when that opportunity presented itself, I'm grateful and I lean into that. And I plan to write more for them in their op-ed section. But I don't have a tremendous amount of publication goals. I like teaching people to write in the ways that allow them to come back to themselves. So the
Do you
writing
ever,
workshop, KC, is where you can find me.
yeah, and in that context, do you edit as well in the sense that do people come to you? I mean, you dip in and out of writing for people like the Washington Post and others. Do you find in that KC environment of people bringing their writing in,
Mhm.
does someone come back and say, "Hey, I've had this is going to come out as a book. I've got a thing going here. What will you take a look and give me some advice or whatever?" I mean,
Absolutely.
yeah, what do you do? Talk about that process a little bit.
I talked to a couple of my editing clients this morning. I've ghostwritten dozens of books. I have multiple editing credentials. I'm currently working on 4 different books with 4 different clients. We had a new book come out last week, and I just launched a new organization called Salt Tooth Writers, and we are producing the second anthology of a collection of work that has come out of the group that I teach writing workshops through. So that's how I spend most of my days, is editing people's work. And I'm transitioning into the world of special education, because in my co-parenting experience, I have the good fortune and the great challenge of participating in parenting a child with pretty extreme special needs.
Mm,
And the last 3 years have enlightened me to the desperate need of our public school system to
mm,
have special educators on their staff that understand the complexities of disabled people and the many contributions they provide to society and their humanity as a whole. So
mm, mm,
I'm juggling a lot of identities, which I've always loved to do. I think I don't
mm.
ever want to do one thing for too long. I'm very easily bored by being one thing, but I love bringing people's work to life, and I love teaching, and I hope to be doing all of this exact same thing in 10 years.
Ernie just sent me a message, and he said, "There's a good and important article right there." So my producer has just communicated. You
Thank
tell
you.
Ashley that I'm very fond of her, and my producer has just told you to write an article. There's a good and important article right there about this whole co-parenting thing and what you just said. So why don't you sketch out the article that you're going to write, since Ernie is all wise and all knowing, and
Thank you, Ernie. I've made a note of it. Thank you.
yeah. But in all seriousness, yeah, I think he's right. That would be a really good piece. Let us know when you've written it so that we can have you come read it on our program again and talk about it. Talk a little bit about the background of this co-parenting again. You've gone into detail with one of the boys you're working with. How did this come about? What's the context?
Well, I married Ashley, and she has 3 sons, and
Okay.
she did a fantastic job of raising the first two, and the youngest is just a little bit younger. So I've been
And
here
what
since
are
he
the age
was,
ranges there?
her boys are 20, 18, and 12.
And is the 12-year-old, I'm not prying too much, I hope, but is that the child that has the issues that you're speaking of?
Yeah, he is differently abled in a multitude of ways, and he is also the light of the world.
Hmm.
He's he's taught me, he teaches me every day how much better of a person I could be if I would widen my perspective on expectation and behavior and lean into life with
Hmm.
love. He is just an extraordinary human being. I'm going to cry thinking about it. He's so good, and he has also given me something else to fight for. I don't
Hmm.
know that I would be. I mean, maybe I would have become an educator in this environment at some point, but to know that I need to move in the direction of special education because that particular field is really lacking in people
Hmm.
with real life experience, not a lack of compassion or intentionality, but I'm at home seeing firsthand what is difficult to translate
Hmm.
um, to very well-intentioned, hardworking people, and I think that I can bring that experience to the classroom and help people who are in dealing with things that we are dealing with.
Hmm. How did you and Ashley meet? And given the fact that she has these boys, what was the context of your meeting? And what was her background in terms of that you want to go to, and don't go there if you're if she wouldn't be comfortable with that. But I'm always curious about relationships. You know, Jeannie and I got Jeannie pregnant when we were 17 and 18. That's 54 years ago. And for some unknown reason, Jeannie hung in there long enough. You know, I say that, you know, basically my evangelical background, I was groomed from birth to be an asshole by divine right, because we believed in the, you know, the patriarchy was from God. We were supposed to be in charge. And it took a long, many years of climbing down. So that's sort of my background. And in terms of her, I'm just curious, because you and Ashley obviously have a complex and interesting story. I wonder how much that you would share in terms of just how you met and what her situation was.
Ashley Parsons' story is the best writer I have ever encountered. And she came into my workshop January of 2020, and she read something she had written that night. And I stopped breathing for the briefest of moments. And it was all over for me at that point. It took me a year and a half to realize I was in love with her, but it didn't take me a second to realize that I deeply admired her perspective and her voice. Ashley is a writer, and she is an art director. That's what she does during the day at this moment in time. But she is an incredible creative, and she was married to a wonderful human being. They were married for 20 years. They have 3 beautiful children together, and they worked really hard to raise their boys and live their lives. And they were both pastors' children. They're both PKs. And when they began their deconstruction process, I think in part of that was Ashley's experience with an awareness of her own queerness. But that's a story I want to leave for her to tell.
Sure. And when she
Ultimately,
writes the book, we will interview her.
that would be wonderful, Frank. I can't wait for her to finish this book. She's been writing it for a minute now.
Well, in all seriousness, tell her, you know, no question at all. If I'm still alive, hey, you know, I'm 71. I could be dead before we finish the program here. So listen,
don't go anywhere.
Just
she
promise
needs to
me
talk
you'll
to
write a
you.
good article about how I died while I was interviewing you. At least let's get one more Washington Post piece out of it. Go out with a bang here. But
I would love for you to interview her. She's
it would be a lot of
she's an
fun.
extraordinary creative, and she would love to be on your show. But she
Yeah.
has her own story to tell. And what I want to say about her is that, you know, life and luck and divine intervention brought us together, and we are all doing our best, and we are operating within the confines of our own understanding and hoping for better every day.
Yeah, well, you know, I know that this is not podcasty kind of material, but in all seriousness here, given the connection that Ashley and I have with her work and my work that she's read, and then our connection here today, Francis, you know, as things go up and down with her and with you and her writing and your work and everything, just consider Ernie and I your real friends, as in, you know, besides this being a podcast, this connection's good. And if something comes up where I can help you in some way, or Ashley, or both of you, or you can help me, let's go there, and keep me posted on what you guys are doing, because I think that the you know, we people have to stick together in these times, and I think that we're well met here. So pass that on to her.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you. That's incredibly generous and kind of you. Thank you.
Yeah, no, sincerely meant. Okay, so let me get back to your performances now. We've been skirting around them. I pay my, you know, I buy my $1,500 ticket and sit in the front row.
Oh, forever, for a lifetime ticket.
Yeah, or, you know, I show up with you know, Ringo Starr or Paul McCartney, and we sit in the glassed-in box up at the top of the stadium. What are we watching? Because I'm so, you know, performance artist is such a nebulous term to me. What do you do, and what is the context of these performances?
Listen, if you're in like the box seats, you might be in the wrong venue. That's too big for me.
Yeah, I was guessing that.
You know, when you come into an environment that I facilitate, it used to be dive bars. I love dive bars. What a sticky tabletop nitty gritty
Sure.
dump this is. Let's do it. And I say that because that's where the people are, the real
Sure.
people who want to participate in this experience. And when I facilitated, meaning I hosted poetry slams, a couple shots of whiskey, get on stage, and we're here to have a hell of a time. And we're here to celebrate the
Mm,
truth of a person behind this microphone. They are going to tell you a story, and they're
mm,
going to tell it to you intentionally. And you are here to give them the space and the opportunity to do so, to celebrate them speaking into the void that they exist and they are doing their best.
mm,
And the energy in the room is just exquisite. It's electric. It's wild. It's unbridled. I have facilitated that for 10 years. If you
mm,
come to my show, sometimes it's just me and a microphone. I released a book with a band that I called the Fellas, and oh, this beautiful man, Eddie Moore, is an incredible musician in Kansas City. And he sat with me in his studio for days and days and days. And I'd say, like, I want to hear something on the piano that sounds like the ocean in the morning, because I
mm,
don't speak anything musical. And Eddie he would work with me and work with me. Um, and we produced an hour and a half long show based on my poetry, where there was a three-piece band behind me playing
mm, mm,
this music that he had written and composed to my work. Um, I have, I love the way that instrumental music can change the energy of poetry. And ultimately, isn't that just music? But I
mm.
don't, again, I don't know anything about music. So it's just all been kind of a surprise to me that bringing all of this together creates the energy it does. But I talk about a lot of things. I talk about shit jobs and how difficult it is to drag yourself out of poverty. I talk about what it's like to be a woman in the world. I talk about what it's like to be a queer in the world. I talk about my sexual trauma. I talk about my frustrations with the church and my disregard of authority. And I weave that all together with a narrative that is constantly extending my hand and welcoming people to the table.
Mm.
And I feel like across the board, whoever you are, when you come to one of my shows, you leave feeling a little more understood than when you arrived.
Mm. How
That
long
is
does
always
this
the goal.
run for? What's the,
No, usually no more than 60 minutes. God help us if you have to listen to me perform for more than
yeah.
half an hour, 45 minutes. Um, but I think I have a very natural stage presence. I don't mind getting up there and doing some jokes. My parents, for as religious as they were, let me watch far too much George Carlin when I was a
Mhm.
kid, too many Mel Brooks movies, and I've got some great comedic timing because of it. So
Mm.
these are the things that I thrive in and love to do. And you come to my show and it's a little bit of everything.
When people come to your writer's workshop, what's the cross section of people? How many people are sitting there? How many come through during the course of a year? Do they come often? Like if someone gets involved? I'm just curious about that work. It sounds great, and I just like to be able to picture it better.
Absolutely. You can see it on Instagram, the Writing Workshop KC. I take photos of my classes every week. I let people exclude themselves if they have a reason to not want to
Mm,
be seen on the internet. But, 15 to 25 students on the online. I do a Tuesday Zoom workshop, and about the same in person.
mm,
Right now, we meet at a little Mexican restaurant on the boulevard in Kansas City, and it's always packed to the gills with people who are there to mingle and eat tamales and then get into the writing.
mm,
I I steal this phrase from an MC that I met years ago who really inspired me to stay in slam poetry, to stay in spoken word. But he called the environment a church for people who don't have one.
mm,
And that's the environment that I foster every week. So I have about 200 students on any given month. Maybe about 50 of them show up in person or online.
mm,
Often they just quietly write in the background. We are not a huge community, but it's a rapidly growing tight knit one, and
mm.
I'm grateful for that.
Well, for anybody listening or watching who doesn't know about these things, which you've just tripped into my area of expertise, which is writers and how things work, that's a huge operation. People don't understand how hard that is to pull off. So your kind of
Thank you.
entrepreneurial ability is noted in that I know that's rare. you know, when you talk about writers' workshops, if there's half a dozen people show up, people will think, you know, they're getting something going. So you've built something phenomenal, and that's insane.
Thank you. I knew that I needed to create a writing workshop at the request of my therapist. I got out and started something else. You know, she was
Yeah,
like, you cannot sit in your apartment all day. Go try to launch something.
yeah,
And it was just, I know intuitively when I have done the right thing, and
yeah.
it expands with little to no effort on my own behalf. And that's exactly what happened in 2019. And
Mm,
February of 2020, I was testing out a new platform called Zoom,
yeah.
trying to launch online workshops. And then, wouldn't you know it, in March, my in-person workshop transitioned seamlessly to the internet. And the people who were with me through the pandemic online, I think, will be with me for the rest of my life.
Mm.
We are woven into the fabric of one another's survival in a time that is, I hope, unparalleled in our life experience.
Yeah, but I just want to end again by saying, aside from all the other stuff you've done and the wonderful content of this talk we've had and the article you read at the beginning, just note everybody that anyone that is running a writer's workshop of any shape or size or form that involves more than a dozen people is the equivalent of a #1 best-selling author on the New York Times list in that line of work. That's, you know, huge. So you just sort of breeze by that, but holy crap, you know, Frances, don't change your name too many more times because, like I said, not only am I dyslexic, I'm getting old, and I
Well,
want to
now that
have
we
you.
share this very important name, I wouldn't give it up for
Yeah,
anything.
don't mess with it anymore. You're one letter away from perfect because mine's spelled a little different, but and I hey, say hi to Ashley for me and thank her and remember Ernie and I are here if you need anything that you think we can help you with, do it. And
Ugh.
we will reach out to you too. And that's seriously meant. And don't click right off. I'm going to leave this and let people go back to their lives who are listening and watching, but you stick around because Ernie will want to talk to you for about 4 hours. You and he have a lot in common.
Can't wait.
Yeah, much love to you and Ashley. Okay, thank you so much. This has
Thank you,
just been
Frank.
great, Francis. Thank you.
Thank you.